Software Engineering Radio episode 69, SOA part 5 with Nico Josuttis. Welcome listeners to another episode of SE Radio, this time an interview with Nico Josuttis on SOA. But before we actually get into the meat of the topic, I really have to come back to the listener survey. Currently, we have about 10% of the downloads in survey participation. So 90% of the people who download this podcast don't fill in the survey. Now, why is that? To be honest, I'm a little bit frustrated here. I mean, it's not too much to expect that as a kind of thank you to the podcast, you just go and fill in the listener survey. So I don't know, maybe people don't actually listen, they just download and don't hear me ask them to please fill in the podcast, or maybe they just don't care. So it doesn't help to motivate to do this thing. So please consider to go back to our website, click on the survey link, and actually give us some feedback about what you think about the podcast, about what you want to hear, and help us tailor the podcast better and also get an understanding of who our audience are, what the structure of the audience is. Well, let's go back to the actual topic today. This one will be a little bit a different episode because we're not going to look at technical aspects of SOA, but rather on some, how SOA influences processes, the culture in big enterprises and stuff. And in order to do this, we have a guest, Nico Josuttis. Some of you might know him from his C++ days, and if he, maybe we're going to talk about C++, but his new topic is SOA. So, Nico, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yes, hello everybody. Introducing, I come from a technical perspective of software development, and my major focus has been for years now large systems. So I got involved, for example, in one big project at a mobile phone company, an international mobile phone company, working for the CRM department, that is customer relation stuff. And the company decided to work with SOA. In fact, to introduce SOA in their company. And we complained so much about what was already there that I got the job to be a team lead for the realization of SOA in that company. So
what is the real realization?
Well, it's different from theory and it's different from ivory towers. So
you say there is some enterprise strategy which doesn't really work, and you were in charge of doing the pragmatics, or?
No, it's yes and no. One problem was that the main focus was on technical details, and SOA is not a technical issue. It has some technical aspects, but SOA is a business strategy for major companies, and you have to deal with processes, you have to deal with architecture, you have to deal with organizations and org charts.
Okay, so you're saying all this discussion about interaction styles, orchestration, loosely coupling stuff, messaging, EAI, web services, it's not really the point. This might be interesting at some stage, but the more important aspect is changing the culture of the organization, or the way it works organizationally.
It doesn't work usually without changing the organization or having an appropriate organization, which might already be there. And but of course, to discuss this with your CEOs and CTOs, you talk about, for example, loose coupling. So, for example, loose coupling explains why you say I need load balancing, failover mechanisms, etc. And but this leads as a consequence to having not a common business object model, And this has some impacts for organizations because suddenly different teams have to map data.
Yeah.
And this influences resources, this influences the way you develop software. So but this is still a pretty technical aspect. Yeah. For example, a very important aspect is that the whole idea of SOA is distributed computing with different ownership.
So, and the important aspect of the different ownership.
Different ownership. That's what qualifies SOA as an appropriate solution.
So different ownership of data or services or?
You can say of data, of responsibilities. So whether you have different departments, whether you have different companies involved, doesn't matter. The important point is that you, from an organizational point of view, have no control about everything. So you have to collaborate from the beginning. And there are different budgets, there are different schedules involved. So this has a high influence on processes.
Okay, so let's look at some of these topics specifically. So one thing I heard you talk about earlier is the idea of not having this centralized large business object model. So maybe you should briefly explain what this is and why it doesn't work in SOA environment.
One thing you learn with real large systems is you can't use bottlenecks.
Yeah.
And that is, you have to decouple things in a way that you can implement one aspect of the system without influencing other aspects of the system. Decoupling or loser coupling is a general concept behind that. There have been a lot of trials to solve your business in a way that you say, let's harmonize things. Let's get a common understanding of what an address is, what a customer is, what the contract is, etc. And it turns out that just from an organizational point of view, you can't harmonize the concept of a customer. There are too many different views. If you try that, either you never succeed or you succeed in a way that it doesn't fit for all backends. If theoretically in large systems you even don't have that problem, then the final problem arises. That is, if one system changes the shared idea of what is a customer and the other systems use this concept, technically use it in the same way, then the other systems have to make corresponding changes. And that's not possible in large organizations.
If one organizational department decides to change something, that would require that the other adapt their stuff basically at the same time.
Yes.
And that you say that's not realistic.
Yes, well, you might have some migration strategy, but it's still too expensive that to say all people have to react on all business aspects of a customer in the whole enterprise. And therefore, deal with the fact that you have different views of customers in your enterprise, in your project. And the interesting thing or example I have is the most my major customer is a mobile phone company as part of a general telephone company, international telephone company. And the most complicated data type we share in this SOA infrastructure among all the systems is the data type of a phone number containing a country code, area code, and then local number. Trying, for example, to harmonize an address type was not possible, simply. They couldn't come to a common conclusion. This does not mean that we don't have a general common idea of what an address is. We have general services to change an address, but they map to different address data in different backends.
So the solution is then having letting every organizational unit, every service have its own data structure, and only the client has to know this. And if the client uses several of these services with different data structures, the client program has to somehow translate.
Yeah, except that things are heterogeneous. That means you have different data, different platforms, different middleware, and deal with what comes from this point. Often people ask me, is SOA something new, something revolutionary?
Yeah.
And I think, for me, this is some kind of revolutionary aspect of SOA. That is like an agility, where we change everything by accepting that requirements change. In SOA, we accept that we don't have homogeneous systems.
But isn't that somehow the opposite of what's maybe commonly thought? Because as you said before, SOA is often introduced into an organization in order to harmonize this and that services. They should be reusable, ideally. You want to harmonize the middleware. So, and you're saying that's all basically not going to work for the reasons we just discussed. So you'll have different middlewares, you have different notions or definitions of what a customer or telephone number is. So, I see what you're saying. I think I probably agree, but isn't that a little bit different to common belief?
From my perspective, the main reason to introduce SOA is getting flexible, based on the fact that you have distributed business processes
and responsibilities,
and that might help to get better reusability. But reusability should not be your major business case for SOA, because it takes a long time that it happens. However, sometimes you sell it that way, because it's the tricky thing with large systems is that if you argument with logic that works for small system, that works when you have control about everything, then people assume that this is intuitive. They say, yes, it's that way, and it sounds so familiar. So just saying, let's introduce a customer service, and then a service that returns the data of a customer, and then saying, and you can reuse this service in any application, then this sounds very reasonable. In fact, in practice, we have about 20 different services that return customer data. Part of this, the reasons for differences is that different data is used and that performance is an issue.
We talked about that in one of the previous episodes of the SOA discussion in SE Radio. But go on, I just wanted to connect.
Okay, yeah. And what I learned in the past is that if you introduce SOA in really a large enterprise, not just a prototype with 10 services or so. Yeah. If you really have something like 30 systems combined with different middleware and hundreds of services, which I see very, very, very rarely in practice, really in production mode, then a usage factor of 1 is a proof for good work. That means
what do you mean by usage factor?
Yeah, that means that if in average every service is used by 1 consumer, then you have done a good work.
But if the average is 1, that you can't ever have set more than one consumer, because you can't have half a consumer using it, right?
Oh yes, you have. We have. It's of course. If you design large distributed processes, you design things that turn out to be different, and in practice it means there are services deployed that are not in use.
Okay.
So in practice you have when you have hundreds of servers and you have a usage factor of 1, you have made a good job, and experiences show that in companies that run SOA for 3 or 4 years, you come to a usage factor of 3 or 4, which is usually a sign of an excellent job. And so don't make your expectations too high on this business case. This is part of the reason, but this is not your primary winning strategy here.
I'd like to look at or add a little historic view, you've been doing large systems for a while, and I know that we've been on a common project a while ago in Hanover, and that was also a large banking system. It was not SOA because the term wasn't invented yet. So I would like to hear what you think compared to what you did back then, and it's probably was called a component-based architecture, I guess. How is what you do at this telecom thing? How is it different? I mean, is it the same thing? So, what are the real differences between 4 years ago component-based development and 2006 or 7 SOA? Is it the same thing, or what has changed actually? What are the challenges? The real challenges are they the same?
Technically, it is pretty similar.
Yeah.
So, in fact, when I had to draw slides about the general architecture of the SOA system now in the mobile phone company, I could reuse slides from that project, from that banking project, because we had different backends, we had some middleware, we had to wrap backends in a way that we abstract business tasks, and we have some front end. So the only difference was that I had to replace solid lines by pipes, because a pipe is a symbol for the enterprise service bus. And it looked that way, that due to the pipe concept, every service or every system component could talk with any other system component. So immediately we got the question of security. Yeah. So if you have your basic services that change the address of a specific backend, of course you don't want that the front ends call these services directly, because then each front end has to call and make sure that all these services are called. So you introduce some composed services that change the address, and you want to make sure that front ends use that service and not the backend services. Yeah.
So you mentioned enterprise service bus. What's that? I mean, do you have something like that at this telecom company?
Well, enterprise service bus is a concept. It's not a tool. Right. You can have an enterprise service bus without having any specific process or hardware running. Yeah. It's just, I think it's another word for the infrastructure of SOA.
Right.
So,
and it's more or less a messaging system.
Yeah, sure. I mean, services are messages you send around. So part of it is some messaging system, but there can be a lot more tasks. For example, intelligent routing of messages is usually a task. Monitoring is a task, and maybe managing business activity monitoring. This is learn how your services flow at runtime through your system, and then make business decisions based on this monitoring. This concept is a concept I have not seen in reality yet, but this is part of the idea which is usually sold to the managers.
Okay. Another thing that I think is quite interesting is this versioning aspect. I mean, if you have one service changing its data structure and the other client or whatever using it, and you don't want to impose that the client changes as you change the service definition, how do you do this? I mean, you have to be able to be tolerant to changes, version stuff. Any ideas there?
The interesting thing with a major concept of SOA, namely loose coupling, is that you have to decide your amount of loose coupling. Because loose coupling has some introduce some benefits, but usually loose coupling leads to drawbacks. For example, if you use asynchronous messaging, if you don't get the answer immediately, the systems you exchange messages with has not to be online, but you get your answer later and have to deal with that. Yeah. So coming back to your question, the question is, are we loose coupled in a way that automatically clients use the latest available version of some service a provider provides, which is often told in theory that this is a good idea. Our experience is that in practice, this is a pretty bad idea if you want to have very stable systems running. And key in our mobile phone company is that the services run. Whenever a customer calls in to get some support, there run services that send customer data to the call center agent.
Yeah.
So this service must run. When we introduce some updates, for example, we have a new attribute customers have.
Yeah.
And we say, okay, this is a new attribute. Even it might be backward compatible, or at least from non-functional aspects backward compatible. Then we introduce the danger that we make mistakes, and that
that it isn't in fact compatible, but you just think it is,
or that we just introduce a new bug. New version, new bug.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So and this happens in practice, of course. And so as a general rule, we say whenever a service is in production mode, it is fixed.
Mm. So references to it are fixed and don't automatically switch to newer versions.
Right. You have to switch explicitly to a newer version of this service. Which of course implies that we have a lot of versions of services.
Yeah, when you never get rid of the old crap.
We get, but this is something you have to deal with from a service life cycle. And as always in large companies, withdrawing existing code without getting some functional benefit for your business is an investment in. That's hard to realize because, well, you pay money for maintainability, and usually your short earnings are more important.
Yeah, it's a garbage collection problem, right? You have to find out that actually nobody is using it anymore in order to be able to withdraw it.
That's not the problem, because in almost every real running SOA, you know who is calling the service.
So it's not like you have these services which are provided by somebody and which are like publicly available in some kind of repository, and then there is somebody using it. You do know your clients.
Yeah, I don't think anything works without that idea, without that concept.
So do you have
maybe there might be a public marketplace where this was, but in an enterprise you have to know your dependencies, because you have to know who has to get informed when you change something, when you when there are problems, etc. So
do you have some kind of registry then that is used at runtime to discover stuff?
Well, it's part of the enterprise service bus monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you need the data, but how you realize that in practice depends. You might have a registry. You might, each provider might write a log file with seeing who is calling. So. That's enough. That's enough to get an understanding, to know I can withdraw the service, or I have to write some consumers a message. Well, couldn't you please switch to the new version?
I mean, in the end, I think it depends on whether the amount of services you have is still small enough to be managed manually. I suspect, I mean, I haven't seen that either, but if the number of services really gets big, it's probably not as easy anymore, people manually looking through the log files or something. So you need infrastructure that manages the service lifecycle and then automatically deploys and undeploys and withdraws things maybe. I'm not saying this is something you should do in the beginning, or that's even something anybody ever did, but it might be.
No, I don't think you're right.
Okay.
The concept of SOA is decentralism. That means you have somebody responsible for some functionality, and that, let's say, department or backend provides some services. And from their point of view, they are pretty small. They can manage that. You don't need central control over that, because somebody is responsible for this service. And they should usually not have a size that they are not, that they can't manage their responsibilities and their interfaces anymore. So you don't need a view of all services to deal with service life cycles. You only need this general view of all services if you either have the idea of that it works plug and play, which doesn't work in practice really, and the other idea, but which is usually the place, if you don't have clear responsibilities or functionality in your enterprise, and you need some customer data, it helps to see, well, here are some services, and this service looks like it is what I need, but this is only to find the right person to talk to.
So that's an organizational problem, and then you,
Yes, I don't think. Well, from a technical point, you might need for loose coupling registries, but from an organization point of view, the idea of SOA is introducing decentralism, and that does not necessarily mean that you introduce centralized repositories. I think you should be very careful with that.
Okay. So before we take a look at business processes in that context, let's have a brief look at your experience with current technology. And we're recording this, by the way, the beginning of 2007. Who knows when it's going to be broadcasted? And we're, just to continue that, we'd really like to thank the 6 Datacom people because they gave us this room at the OOP conference where we can record the podcast. So we should add this thank you note here. So what kind of technologies do you use? Specifically, which parts of the WS something web service stack are you using?
None.
I don't use XML?
Well, WS you said, not XML.
Okay. Maybe that's that. So what do you use in this?
I don't only have one customer. And
in this big customer here.
That big customer, that's interesting. They started with TIBCO Rendezvous.
Yeah. Which is basically a messaging middleware that's 55 years old.
Well, that times the project wasn't named an SOA project. It was an enterprise integration project. And it turned out later on that we could use the infrastructure aspects of enterprise integration for SOA infrastructure. Yeah. So we stayed with that technology, but as I said, we have different countries involved in that company, and when we tried to connect 2 countries, both using TIBCO Rendezvous, it turned out that they couldn't talk to each other. So this is no guarantee. Yeah. So even if you decide on your protocol, on your infrastructure protocol, whether it's web service or something else, that's not enough to be sure that you are interoperable. And those who know the web service standardization disaster, let's say it that way, is know that
that was the point I wanted to get to. Your opinion about the web service standardization.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we have about, I think, these days we have about between 60 and 80 different web service standards, and we use in the meantime we use web services, but it's only part of our middleware. We have mappings between web services and other technologies.
The data structures are defined as an XML schema globally, and then you transport them using TIBCO and web services. Is that what I?
Yeah,
understand?
our repositories, our language that describes the semantic and the signature and the interfaces are not proprietary for a specific infrastructure protocol. Well, yes, and okay. Let me first finish the other sentence. That is, it's really interesting to see that we have something like between 60 and 80 standards, and that you have additional standards that provide interoperability of these standards. Like the VSI basic profile, which VSI is an organization founded only to gain interoperability using the web service standards. I mean, that says something. Yeah. And in practice, I think they made something like 120 requirements, additional requirements or constraints, and 24, I think, extensions to the 5 basic web service standards, 5 of 60 or 70. And now they say you are interoperable which does not mean that you are really interoperable. You still have to decide some things when you realize your SOA, but it works better. You can connect your BizTalk or Microsoft BizTalk web service with an, I don't know, Access open source generated Java adapter.
So what would it be? It would be schema for data description, and then basically WSDL 1.1 to describe services, if you have services, if you have web services. And what else is there in this WSI interoperability thing?
Well, it's called the WSI Basic Profile 1.1, which is the current one, and they standardize the low-level technology, which or protocols, which is XML and HTTP. So some certain things. Beside that, they standardize the interface language, which is WSDL or WSDL. Yeah. And which standardize the protocol on top of HTTP, which is SOAP. And beside that, they standardize the UDDI, the broker or the naming service of web service, but this doesn't play such an important role in basic web services communication.
Business process integration, is this from your point of view, is this are you doing like orchestration and process modeling at your I always must make sure I don't mention the name of the company, since everybody kind of knows what that company is, but so do you use this
everybody
stuff?
Knows
yeah
it?
You know, I know it. Okay. So we here, everybody know it, you know it, I know it, but so do you use business process modeling and this stuff, or are you just doing the service layer?
Well, of course we do. We have business process modeling. Otherwise, we can't come from new functionality to running IT software. The question is whether we use the specific, appropriate, technology-supported way. Maybe web services thing should be used to realize business process modeling. For example, using BPEL as a standard.
You do this or you don't do this?
We do a little bit of that.
Okay.
I mean, we currently try to use BPEL as an orchestration engine. Mm-hmm. Well, for that we had to use beta software of some vendors. I would say it's a pretty good concept for common business processes. But tooling is, well, let's say in the second generation, which is I learned it from Gregor Hope that it is the hockey stick function. So the hockey stick function generation of tooling is up to a certain degree of complexity. It's pretty flat. And then there comes where the stick gets up to the hand. Okay, yeah. So if you raise a certain level, then a complexity or the effort for a tool raises more than the complexity you have. So I think we are in that state. And you need that state to get good tools, but you need some time to deal with these things.
Okay, although we wanted to talk about non-technical aspects, somehow we still talked about technical stuff. It's probably my questions here. So let's look at more organizational issues. What do you need to change in an organization in order to make it SOA compatible? How do organizations change to be able to adopt an SOA successfully?
Okay, the most important point of SOA is distributed computing.
Yeah, we have that.
And distributed business processing. And distributed business processing doesn't start with implementation. It starts with, design. It starts with high-level design. Guess, for example, you are a company and you need some additional functionality, or you need some new business model, and you want to realize this in your systems. Then you have to break down this functionality, which is part of your business process modeling process. And to some extent, you say, well, this should be IT supported. And so you break down things. However, you have your running systems. You have your existing backends. that play a role. And these, let me say, backends are involved in this new functionality.
Yeah.
Now, in the past, we had these monolithic fiefdoms that could you could give them the task introduce this new functionality, realize it in your IT system.
Yeah.
This doesn't work any longer. You have different departments, providing different services because they are responsible for different things. You have billing, you have customer relations, you have fulfillment, and these are really different big backends. SAP systems, host J2EE server farms, whatsoever. And now you want to introduce a new functionality. That means every backend has to do something. And it only makes sense together. Distributed business process. So you start with an high-level design, or what is usually these days called a solution design, up above the different departments you have. The different departments you have in your company.
So like a bit like CRC cards that you would like to associate responsibilities and collaborations with departments?
That might be one technique.
Yeah, of course.
I think
just to connect.
Yeah, but the most important point is there is something above the different departments, and I think you need a project culture. You're getting from a like department culture to a cross-cutting project culture. You also need the department culture. These are the backends.
Yeah.
But you need a project culture, and it's in the hands of the project cultures to drive the whole thing.
To get the job done.
Try to do that with old existing departments that usually decide everything on a new solution. So this is the hard part, and
it also contradicts to some extent to what you said before, because you said each department or provider or backend should be responsible for its own services, and so that's the one aspect or the one viewpoint. And now you said there is another viewpoint which is more like cross-cutting or orthogonal, which looks at introducing a new piece of functionality into all these systems so that altogether it makes sense.
Yes, and for example, in the mobile phone company, they invented new org charts for that. They said we have the departments, but we also have the solution management departments, which were somehow high level above everything, and they are project departments. So, I mean, they get the task. Here's a new functionality I want to have. Make a high level design. Go to the different departments. Asked for their effort to realize this, and then we see the business case. We know, or we have an idea what brings us the new business functionality, and then we know the price for realizing it, and then we decide. And this is interesting in the mobile phone company. Every 3 months we have a meeting where we decide on a new release what we realize, and there all these solutions come together, and we know the benefit, we know the different efforts the different department has, and now we have to find an ideal solution to get the best benefit for the company as a whole. All departments should have tasks for about 100% of their real effective time. Yeah, and then you follow that in realization, and the solution manager sees, well, because in practice, of course, things change and you find bugs. So, and it's very important that with this business model, you collaborate, because if there's, for example, one department is a profit center and says, okay, I have... I can give you this service here. We have a service that does it for you, but it's slightly different, and that causes many costs for the other departments.
Yeah.
Then it's bad design.
Yeah.
And you pay for that in the long term.
So you say the typical cost center designs where you have these islands in your companies who each make sure that they make profit as much as possible, that doesn't work if you want to introduce cross-cutting distributed processes, because then the people will say, I don't care what the others do, I do it so that I maximize my own profit.
Or you have a profit model in your organization that deals with these facts,
right?
So that you can pay But then, well, I mean, that means you have to break down your new functionality not only technically and from a business point of view, also from a pricing point of view.
Yeah.
And I don't think that works. So we have the good fact that our IT departments have a flat budget. So they are not profit centers. And we say, well, with this flat budget, we want to get the most functionality we have to get the best in the business. And yeah, I mean, but it changes a lot. And if you don't have support from CEOs for this kind of different thinking in companies, then you will fail. I've seen that. And it's interesting. You can say SOA is some kind of problem detector. If a company is really able to collaborate, and if not, they might blame SOA for it. They say before we introduced SOA, everything worked fine. I mean, it didn't work fine. You have that in reality. You have distributed processes without introducing SOA in your large companies, but it's not explicit. Yeah.
Now, assume your current job is finished with your mobile phone company. You take off 2 months and rebreathe, and then you go to your next customer, and your job is to introduce an SOA there. How do you do this? How do you start? What are the steps?
Well, first of all, make sure that management is behind you, that there is the understanding that SOA is a company or business strategy, and technology is only a part of it.
Yep.
And I talked already about the problems of business process management, but there are many other processes you have to introduce in your company for service life cycles, for solution management, also, for example, more technically for model-driven development, because you generate a lot of code for interoperability, and so you need processes in practice that work for that. And well, first of all, I don't see no other chance but introducing SOA in a way that it evolves in a company.
So start small.
Start small, but think big. But think big and think small. Start small, think big, and think small. I mean it. Yes. Okay. Well, start small is clear. To evolve, iterate to get the best, and to understand how business aspects, process aspects, architectural aspects influence each other. Think big, because you have large systems, and you, for example, must not introduce bottlenecks, but also think small in a way that
think simple, maybe.
Think simple, maybe that's better. In a way that you avoid the Yacni principle, so you ain't gonna need it principle, which means you think you need some kind of flexibility that does not.
That's actually a tendency I've also seen, that people think they have to care for all kinds of possibilities, and then they build this huge complex system with all kinds of dynamic runtime facilities, and you'll never need it.
Yeah, I give you a simple example. We have in our systems, we have started with the idea that it is easy that a service can move from one backend to another. And of course, this to realize that, you need some kind of indirection. It turned out that in practice this never happened, but it turned also out that this caused a lot of problems in our code generation processes, etc. So we have difficulties for example, to debug services, because suddenly you have, due to the indirection, you have a name change, you have a symbolic name, and this is mapped to a real physical name.
Just in JNDI lookups and local.
For example, So this is a typical example where I learned, don't start with these things, or don't start with the repositories. First things first. So, but don't forget that the result is a large system.
Yeah, but isn't that typical that in order to build large systems and to build scalable systems, you should keep the individual building blocks and the rules that govern the architecture as simple as possible?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's a general principle.
Simplicity is a principle. Yeah, how often do you see that in practice?
No, I mean, I'm saying, yeah, of course, it's good to keep things simple, but I'm saying that especially if you try to build big systems or general things, even more, that is a force to drive things even simpler. Look at HTTP.
Simplicity is a key,
right? Yeah. And it's even more key the bigger you get.
Yes. And for several reasons. One reason is, only simplicity scales, both even from the understanding of the people. I mean, you have hundreds of programmers involved, and they have to understand their role, what they do, their constraints, and they won't understand it if you have complicated architecture pictures. Yeah. So that's part of large systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different viewpoints. I mean, an architecture can be complex and sophisticated internally if you have a well-defined, what I'd like to call a programming model, a well-defined view of the architecture that the developers see.
Well, I mean, now I come back to web services. There's something that there are more than only the standardization problem wrong with web services.
Yeah, we know. I know.
I mean, another big problem is that web service is a protocol standard, not an API standard.
Yeah,
which leads to the fact that the responsibility often from enterprise integration teams or SOA competence center ends at a WSDL file.
Yeah,
and each team uses their own code generator. So how to they make it very different, which is definitely not simple, especially as they will deal with the same problems and deal with them in different ways.
Yep.
So what you say is, our task is to provide a very simple way for the business teams to work.
Exactly.
Usually leads to the task of providing them an API.
Yes, or tooling.
Or tooling that generates an API.
Yes.
And for example, we change infrastructure in that mobile phone company right now, and we can keep the API. We switch from TIBCO to web services, and we keep the API. And that is for the business people, nothing changed.
Yeah.
And this is key. And I see too much people only are focusing on web services. And of course, a web service, even if it's a standard, in 10 years there will be a different standard.
Yes.
And be very careful to that you use web services only if you are sure now we come to the infrastructure aspects of our problem.
Don't expose all that stuff to application code, to business logic or whatever you call it.
And not to design, etc. So for example, if people have this strange idea of specifying services using WSDL, this is something very strange.
Why?
Because
I mean, I have talked about that before, but I'd just like to hear this from you for some reason.
WSDL is incomplete. They don't deal with non-functional attributes, and WSDL is too broad. So usually you have to constrain things that are allowed there.
That's also true for XML schema, I guess.
That's part of it.
Right.
So WSDL and XML schema,
right.
Yes. So you, for example, think very carefully with enumerations.
Yeah.
Think carefully with choices,
inheritance,
etc. Because sorry to say that, I know a lot of Java guys are here, but Java is not the only programming language. And if you build large systems and you integrate legacy, which is large systems are legacy, period, then you deal with programming languages that have a problem with inheritance, and you can deal with that, but.
So that's always something I say. Design your data structures, for example, with simple UML diagrams. You only have attributes, objects. You maybe distinguish between, composition relationship and non-composition. You maybe distinguish between entities and value types. And then you have cardinalities on the references, and that's about it.
Yeah.
And then
Or in other ways, structural data types.
Yeah.
That is record structs and arrays on lists.
Kind of these things.
And based on some
and forget
basic
all the
types.
rest of schema.
That's the most solid and way to be sure that your investments work for the next years.
So as we slowly but certainly wrap up this session, I guess, another term I've been hearing quite often in the terms of in context of SOA is what people call governance. Sounds a bit very much business to me. So can you explain what governance stands for? What is that? What role does it play?
Well, governance first of all stands for itself. I mean, governance is a governance of that, making sure that things turn out to be right. So SOA governance, which is usually part of IT governance in your company, has the idea of ensuring that SOA works, is performed right. And as you have learned now in the meantime, this includes not only infrastructure, it includes architectural aspects and processes. And it all comes together. So when you introduce some team that establish or adopts an SOA in your company, then these teams should be able to govern the whole topic in a useful way that all comes together and works together. And
it's like a steering committee?
Well, steering is usually the name for the people, steering over the governance team. That is, I think governance is more often called an integration competence center. So that you say there is some team responsible that all makes sense together. You can also say that it's a system architect of SOA, but as I said, it's system architect not only for technical aspects.
System, the system means the enterprise, not the technically.
And one of the major reasons SOA fails in practice is a lack of governance, which is always combined with a lack of understanding what SOA is about, because otherwise they would know that you need some kind of governance. But I've also very often seen that, very often sounds like I've seen hundreds of SOA projects. That's not the case right now. But anyway, I've seen several times that one problem of the teams responsible for establishing SOA in a company don't fulfill two very important requirements this team should have. Requirement number one, you have to establish decentralization. To the extreme, that means make sure that you are not involved any longer. So establish as a central team decentralized processes. And it's difficult for some people to work on a task so that they give up responsibility and control. And the other thing is you want to establish service orientation. Service has to do with service. And service, this is a team that is a service team for the business teams in the company.
So you say the business people rule and not the IT people.
Right. They they defined the requirements. They asked for problems. And I've seen a lot of problems because the central teams were some kind of ivory towers and not having time and not enough resources. It's also a management issue to go to the business teams and to work with them, explaining the idea, the concept, developing the first adapters, and then learning what went wrong, seeing how the process lacks in practice, and then making some changes. So homework is so important for successful
homework.
That the homework is done. That you might have all the concepts, all the tools.
So you meant not just talk about it, but actually really do things.
Yeah, that these central teams have to be part of using the processes
and not
they
be the ivory
invent.
tower team.
Yes.
Yeah.
And let's understand yourself as a service provider for your company or companies.
Okay, anything else you want to say before we wrap this up?
Sure. I mean, I have no idea when this talk will be published, but there is some advertisement. There is a book coming out. I'm currently writing one.
So when is it going to be published, the book, roughly?
The idea is mid of 2007.
Well, we can make sure that the podcast will be at mid 2007.
Sure, that would be great.
Yeah.
So SOA in practice by O'Reilly, and this will contain hopefully a lot of useful things I have talked about here and a little bit more.
Okay, cool. So thank you very much for being on the show. And
thank you, Markus.
Thanks for listening to Software Engineering Radio. If you want to get more information about Software Engineering Radio, or if you want to give us feedback, please go to our website at se-radio.net. You can also contact the team at team@se-radio.net, although we prefer entries in our comments system on the website so other people can see what you think. Software Engineering Radio wants to thank Henning Pauli for the intro and outro music, as well as Libsyn for providing the bandwidth. This episode of SE Radio, as well as all other episodes, is licensed under Creative Commons license. See the Software Engineering Radio website for details.